Imagine standing before a colossal pyramid, its limestone casing still gleaming in the desert sun, so bright it blinds the eyes of anyone who dares to look too long. To most, it was a monument of glory, a stairway for a king to ascend into the afterlife. But whispering through the sands was another story, a darker one. That beneath these stones lay the bodies of 10,000 men, buried alive by the will of a single pharaoh. They say the pyramid wasn't just a tomb for the ruler, was a tomb for his workers too. A sacrifice of human lives entombed forever in the name of power, eternity, and fear. Was it devotion? Was it tyranny? Or was it simply a warning carved into stone for every generation that followed? That is the question history forces us to ask. Ancient Egypt is often remembered for its splendor, for the Nile that gave life to the land, for its advances in art, science, and engineering. But it was also a world where human life could be crushed beneath the ambitions of kings. The pharaoh, after all, was not merely a ruler. He was a living god, an earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon deity, chosen by the heavens themselves. To serve him was to serve the divine, and to disobey him was to risk annihilation, not only in this life, but in the eternal afterlife Egyptians so deeply feared losing. In this climate of awe and terror, stories grew of rulers who demanded not just labor, but blood and empire, where loyalty was sealed in death. The tale of the pharaoh who entombed 10,000 workers has drifted through centuries like a half-remembered nightmare. Historians debate whether it was ritual sacrifice, punishment, or a deliberate myth meant to magnify fear. But scattered fragments from Greek chroniclers, whispers from Egyptian texts, and grim archaeological finds all weave into a tapestry of terror. The workers of the Nile were not faceless slaves, as Hollywood sometimes paints them. Many were farmers drafted into seasonal service, building pyramids when the floods made agriculture impossible. But the labor camps were brutal, the mortality rates staggering. Now imagine, not just death from exhaustion, but death imposed with chilling deliberation. A living burial, walls of stone sealing men inside chambers with no escape. To build eternity, their breath was the mortar, their silence the foundation. One can almost picture the final moments. 10,000 men driven into the belly of the pyramid, torches flickering, the smell of sweat and panic filling the air. Guards with whips pushing them deeper, while overseers sealed the passages with heavy limestone blocks. Darkness creeping in as voices rose in desperate prayer, curses, cries for mercy, and then silence. Above them, the pharaoh's tomb would rise in triumph, while below, their bodies, whether real or symbolic, would rot in eternal night. If true, this act wasn't just cruelty, it was theater. It was the pharaoh declaring himself not only master of life, but arbiter of death itself. But which pharaoh was capable of such a deed? Some point to Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, a man remembered even by later Egyptians as a tyrant. Others whisper of Djoser, whose step pyramid began Egypt's obsession with stone monuments. Or perhaps it was a lesser-known ruler whose thirst for legacy demanded an offering so large it could never be forgotten. The truth may be buried beneath centuries of sand and stone. But the legend remains that the greatest monuments of the ancient world may have been cemented not only with stone, but with human lives. And here lies the paradox of Egypt's grandeur. Beauty born from brutality, eternity carved from flesh and blood. The pyramids inspire awe even today, but they also force us to ask, how much suffering was the price of their glory? To explore that question, we must peel back the polished limestone casing and look into the shadows of history where ambition, religion, and cruelty intertwine. For behind every monument, there are always the forgotten voices, silenced forever, yet echoing still in whispers carried by the desert wind. Legends in the ancient world rarely emerged from nothing. They were born from fragments of truth, sharpened by whispers, and repeated until myth and memory fused into one. The tale of the pharaoh who entombed thousands of his workers is one such legend. But to truly grasp how such a story could take root, we need to step inside the mind of Egypt itself, into a civilization where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than the veil of the desert dust. To the Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transition, and the pharaoh stood at its crossroads. He was the guardian of Mat, the divine balance of the universe. He ensured the Nile rose, the sun crossed the sky, and the cosmos held its order. But if he faltered, if his divine power weakened, the entire kingdom could collapse into chaos. This burden justified acts of extraordinary cruelty. After all, what was the death of 10,000 men compared to the survival of millions? And if those deaths also magnified the pharaoh's aura, striking terror into any who might question his divinity, then all the better. Greek historians like Herodotus painted vivid pictures of despotic pharaohs. Writing centuries after the pyramids had been built, Herodotus claimed that Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, shut down temples, enslaved his people, and conscripted them into decades of backbreaking labor. He even suggested that Khufu prostituted his own daughter to raise funds for his projects. Though modern scholars challenge the accuracy of these tales, they reveal how later generations remembered Egypt's greatest kings not as benevolent god-kings, but as tyrants cloaked in gold. When people spoke of pharaohs burying workers alive, they weren't speaking of kindness, misunderstood. They were voicing the memory of power wielded without mercy. And yet, archaeology gives us its own whispers. Deep beneath pyramid shafts, skeletons have been uncovered, sometimes in cramped chambers, sometimes scattered among tools, as if men had been sealed in mid-labor. Were these accidental deaths, or deliberate? Some argue these were unlucky builders caught in collapses. Others see something far darker: deliberate burial as companions to the king in death. Human sacrifice, after all, was not unknown in the ancient world. The early dynasties of Egypt practiced retainer sacrifice, burying servants alongside their rulers so they could continue serving them in the afterlife. This practice faded after the first dynasty, replaced by symbolic figurines known as shabti. But could echoes of that custom have survived, twisted into something even more brutal by a pharaoh determined to immortalize his reign? Picture it, the final days of construction. The pyramid, nearly complete, towers over the desert, its polished casing stones shining like a beacon to the heavens. The workers, exhausted, filthy, but alive, expect to return to their families. Instead, soldiers encircled the site. A decree is read aloud though. Pharaoh has commanded their eternal service. Passageways are sealed, the air thick with panic. Some try to fight, others collapse in resignation. The pharaoh's priests declare it a sacred honor, a transformation of flesh into stone, breath into eternity. And then the silence of the desert takes them. Whether literal or symbolic, such stories carried weight. To the common Egyptian farmer, drafted into royal service, they were warnings. Your life is not your own. To foreign visitors, they were cautionary tales of the pharaoh's divine wrath. And to later chroniclers, they were the perfect lens through which to explain the unfathomable scale of the pyramids. After all, how could human hands alone achieve such miracles without divine terror forcing them on? But here lies the twist. Recent studies suggest that many pyramid workers were not slaves, but laborers who were fed, housed, even honored with tombs of their own. Their skeletons bear signs of medical care, evidence that broken bones were set, infections treated. Could this mean the tales of mass burial were propaganda, exaggerated by enemies of Egypt or by later storytellers hungry for sensationalism? Perhaps. And yet why do these stories persist, across cultures, across centuries? Myths of rulers burying their builders alive exist in China, in Mesopotamia, in South America. It is as if humanity itself, staring up at colossal monuments, needed to explain them not only with ingenuity, but with horror. The grandeur of Egypt was built on backs and bones. To imagine 10,000 workers sealed beneath stone is horrifying. But first we must understand how those workers came to be there at all. The pyramids were not just monuments, they were engines of social control. Every block of limestone was also a statement. The pharaoh commands, and all obey. In the Nile Valley, labor was life itself. When the river flooded, farmers could not work their fields. Pharaohs turned that idle season into power by conscripting men to work on royal projects. It was a clever system, cloaked as duty to the gods. Instead of rebellion, peasants saw their toil as cosmic service building eternal stairways for the king's soul. Yet beneath the pious surface was raw coercion. Refuse the summons, and you risked lashes, imprisonment, or worse. Imagine the caravan of men marching to Giza, villages emptied, fathers pulled from families, their absence leaving fields untended. They arrived at sprawling labor camps, part barracks, part prison. Archaeology reveals these camps had bakeries, breweries, and medical quarters, showing the state sustained its workers. But feeding bread and beer did not make the labor humane. Days stretched under a merciless sun, backs bent until spines cracked, hands blistered on ropes and chisels. For every block that rose in triumph, another man's body broke in silence. Here lies the seed of the legend. If workers were treated as expendable in life, why not in death? What difference was there between collapsing from exhaustion in a quarry and being entombed alive in a sealed passage? Both served the same purpose. The pharaoh's eternity. Power in Egypt was theatrical. The pharaoh's image was carefully curated, not only as God, but as something more terrifying, indispensable. To question him was to invite chaos. To resist him was to court annihilation. A mass burial of workers, whether real or myth, fit this performance perfectly. 10,000 men sacrificed not just to build the king's tomb, but to prove that his will outweighed the value of human life itself. The rumor alone was enough to instill awe, fear, and obedience across the Nile Valley. But stories like these also reveal a paradox. For while Egypt's monuments project eternal strength, they also whisper fragility. Why would a pharaoh need to stage such horror unless he feared being forgotten? Why entomb workers unless he doubted his immortality? The pyramid was not only a tomb, it was a desperate gamble against oblivion. And so the myth of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive is not just about cruelty. It is about power's hunger for permanence, the lengths to which rulers will go to outlast death itself. But this is only the beginning, because what comes next are the testimonies. The traces left in stone and the chilling parallels across other civilizations. Legends do not survive on whispers alone. They thrive when etched into stone, sung by poets, or carried by travelers who stand in awe of what they have seen. To understand the tale of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive, we must examine the fragments of memory, those left by ancient scribes, foreign historians, and the ruins themselves. The Greeks, arriving in Egypt centuries after the Great Pyramids had been raised, stood astonished before the monuments. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, wandered the Nile in the 5th century BCE and recorded tales that blend observation with rumor. He wrote of Pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheopskam, manding thousands into labor, even forcing his own daughter into shame to finance his colossal pyramid. For Herodotus, cruelty was part of the explanation. How else could one man command such impossibility unless fear itself had been mortared into every block? But Herodotus was not alone. Later, chroniclers spoke of skeletons found in sealed passages, of bones jumbled in corridors where no one was meant to pass. Whether these were accidents of collapse, victims of disease, or deliberate burials, the image was unforgettable. Laborers trapped in the tomb they had raised, as if their lives were payment for eternity. Modern archaeology complicates the tale. Excavations at Giza have revealed worker cemeteries near the pyramids. These were not anonymous mass graves, but orderly burials, sometimes with offerings of beer and bread. It suggests a respect for the laborers, far from the image of disposable slaves. Yet even here lies a chilling possibility. What if these were the fortunate ones? The honored dead, while others forgotten in sealed chambers, had no such dignity. And then there are the silences. Egyptian inscriptions sing endlessly of Pharaoh's victories, of offerings to the gods, of eternal reign. They do not speak of suffering, nor of men buried alive. But absence in official records often signals what rulers wanted erased. Silence can be as revealing as words carved in stone. The tale persisted because it fit the spectacle of Egypt. To later generations, the pyramid was not merely a tomb, but a mausoleum raised on human cost. Visitors could not stand before such immensity without wondering, how many lives did this devour? Thus, the myth of 10,000 buried alive became more than a story. It became a lens through which outsiders interpreted Egypt, an empire of glory. Yes, but also of terror. The desert is silent now, but beneath the sands lie voices, bones, tools, and half-erased inscriptions that hint at the truth behind the legend. When modern archaeologists brushed the dust off the workers' villages at Giza, they uncovered neat rows of mud brick houses. Within them lay grinding stones, bread ovens, and amphorae filled with traces of beer. These were not the trappings of slaves driven by whips alone. They suggested something more complicated. Organized labor, fed and provisioned by the state, yet still caught in the grip of Pharaoh's monumental will. And yet, alongside these villages, they found mass graves. Trenches where dozens of skeletons lay in disorder, sometimes broken, sometimes bound. Were these laborers who died of exhaustion and were hastily buried? Or were they the very victims of the tale, the ones entombed as living offerings to secure the Pharaoh's afterlife? No inscription explains. Archaeology leaves the question suspended, forcing us to decide whether we see benevolent workers or sacrifice pawns. The written accounts, though later, are equally haunting. Herodotus claimed that Khufu shut down temples, taxed every household, and forced laborers by the 100,000 into his service. His pyramid, he said, took 20 years to build, and men died by the thousands under its weight. Diodorus Siculus, another Greek historian, echoed this, describing Egypt as an empire that consumed its own children to satisfy rulers' vanity. Their words painted a picture not of cooperative builders, but of a population terrorized into eternal silence. Egyptian records, of course, tell a different story. They speak of offerings to the gods, of Pharaoh's glory, of pyramids rising as symbols of divine order. Nowhere do they mention lives lost, nor bodies buried alive. But this silence is precisely what fuels the legend. For why would Pharaoh's scribes ever admit such brutality? Power erases its own crimes, leaving only stone and rumor behind. Even in modern times, discovery adds fuel to the fire. In the 1990s, archaeologists uncovered a shaft at Giza where dozens of skeletons were found, sealed in, their bodies seemingly crushed under collapsed stone. Some argued it was a construction accident. Others whispered it was deliberate. Men left entombed as guardians of the pyramid, their sacrifice binding the tomb for eternity. And then there is memory. Travelers through centuries, Persian soldiers, Greek philosophers, Roman chroniclers stood before the pyramids and felt the same awe, the same terror. They could not imagine such scale without cruelty. To them, the monument itself was proof. Each block a coffin, each corridor a whisper of those who never walked free. So the tale of the Pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive became more than rumor. It became a story etched into the very stones of Giza, whether true, half-true, or a projection of fear. Archaeology gives us fragments, chronicles give us suspicion, and silence leaves us with haunting possibility. Egypt may have given us one of the most enduring tales of mass burial, but it was far from alone in wedding construction to suffering. Across the ancient world, rulers shared the same conviction. Monuments were not just to be built, they had to be consecrated with human lives. In Mesopotamia, the builders of ziggurats often invoked the gods with blood. Archaeologists at Ur and Eridu have found child skeletons interred beneath temple foundations. Were they sacrifices meant to anchor the structure, to ensure it stood forever? The evidence suggests a grim ritual, a living cornerstone, entombed as both offering and stabilizer. It was death engineered into architecture. Farther east, in China, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, gave the world its most chilling example. His vast tomb, guarded by the terracotta army, was not only a wonder of art, but also of cruelty. Ancient texts whispered that artisans, once sealed within, were never allowed to leave. Some were buried alive, trapped with rivers of mercury and walls laced with crossbows designed to fire upon intruders. His monument was not just for eternity, was for control, ensuring silence forever. Even Persia was not immune. Accounts of palace construction under Xerxes and Darius describe workers whipped, chained, and driven to exhaustion in the scorching sun. Their monuments, Persepolis, the grand stairways, the towering columns, still inspire. But look closer at the inscriptions, and you see glimpses of menace, reminders that the king ruled by divine will, that defiance would be crushed without mercy. Rome, too, made death into spectacle. While it didn't bury laborers beneath its amphitheaters, it used the bodies of the conquered in another way. Gladiators, slaves, and criminals became mortar for empire, their blood spilled in arenas that glorified the state. The Colosseum itself was a monument not only of engineering, but of orchestrated death. What ties these civilizations together is not coincidence. It is the logic of power. Rulers saw in death a tool to inspire fear, to bind loyalty, to etch permanence into stone. The more terrible the act, the more enduring the monument seemed to become. For those who witnessed it, the cruelty was unforgettable. For those who came later, the silence of victims became legend. And so, the tale of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive is not an isolated nightmare. It is part of a wider pattern, a grim truth of civilization. That greatness often demanded horror, and that monuments which dazzle us today were built in shadows. But the question lingers: why did such cruelty become ritualized? Why did rulers believe blood ensured stability? Archaeology tells us the pharaoh's alleged cruelty was not unique. Civilizations across the globe, in different centuries, reached for the same brutal logic: to bind their monuments with blood, to anchor stone with flesh, to fuse power with death. Take Mesopotamia, the world's first urban civilization. Excavations in the city of Ur revealed skeletons of young attendants buried beside their rulers, complete with lyres, jewelry, and weapons. Some were poisoned, others may have been struck down, all to accompany the dead king into eternity. But beneath temples and ziggurats, scholars have also uncovered the remains of children laid carefully into foundation pits. These were not accidents of burial, they were ritual acts. The logic was terrifying. A living sacrifice was thought to stabilize the building, as though human life itself were a structural material, stronger than brick. Now shift east to China, to the colossal tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. His terracotta warriors, thousands of them, stand in frozen ranks, a silent army carved from clay. But the chronicles suggest not everyone walked away once construction was finished. Sima Qian, the Han historian, wrote that those who knew the secrets were not permitted to leave. Scholars believe engineers, artisans, and guards were sealed inside the tomb itself, entombed in perpetual silence with rivers of mercury flowing around them. The emperor did not just want to cheat death, he wanted his builders to serve him beyond the grave. Their lives were the final layer of mortar. The Persians left subtler traces, but cruelty was woven into their grandeur as well. At Persepolis, inscriptions describe Darius and Xerxes boasting of divine mandate, while workers labored under chains. Greek sources, hostile but vivid, describe overseers whipping slaves to move colossal stone blocks. The stairways and columns gleam with elegance, but in every carved relief of tribute bearers, you sense the echo of domination. The message that the king's will was enforced not just by armies, but by the suffering of those who toiled under the lash. And then Rome, the empire that turned cruelty into choreography. Unlike Egypt or China, it did not bury workers in its foundations, but instead, it made its monuments into arenas of human death. The Colosseum was built with the sweat of Jewish captives taken after the fall of Jerusalem, and once completed, the building itself became a devourer of lives. Gladiators, slaves, condemned criminals torn apart before tens of thousands. If Egypt buried workers to make stone eternal, Rome spilled blood inside stone to make memory eternal. Every amphitheater was a theater of mortality, proof that Rome could control not just life, but spectacle itself. What we see across these civilizations is a pattern: death as foundation, Cruelty as consecration. The Pharaoh's story of burying 10,000 workers alive may be legend, may be exaggeration, but it resonates because it mirrors truths we find everywhere. Greatness was never clean. Power was never bloodless. To stand in awe before these monuments is to stand also in the shadow of those crushed beneath them. But why this obsession? Why did rulers believe that a building, a tomb, or a palace was not complete without human life poured into it? Was it divine demand, psychological control, or simply the ultimate show of power? Why did the Pharaoh and so many rulers across civilizations come to believe that only human lives could stabilize their monuments? The answer lies in something more profound than fire. It was belief. For them, blood was not just liquid, it was power, a divine currency that could purchase eternity. In ancient Egypt, life was not seen as ending with death. Instead, it continued, transmuted, reshaped. To bury workers alive was not simply punishment. It was a grotesque gift offering them up to the gods to protect the pharaoh's afterlife. The workers became eternal guardians, their suffering transformed into loyalty that could never waver. Egyptian theology linked blood to cosmic order. Sacrifice maintained the balance of the universe. To deny blood was to risk chaos. But Egypt was not alone. The Aztecs believed the blood carried tonality, the life force gifted by the gods. Without offerings, the sun itself might falter, the cosmos collapse. Priests cut their tongues and bled themselves to sustain the world, but captives gave the ultimate payment. When temples were raised, the stone was baptized with human blood to fuse it with divine energy. In this theology, cruelty was not cruelty, was cosmic necessity. The Maya, too, tied architecture with suffering. Kings performed bloodletting rituals, drawing cords of thorns through their tongues or genitals, and letting the drops fall on paper that was then burned, the smoke carrying lifeblood to the heavens. And when pyramids rose, captives' blood was mingled with mortar, sanctifying every step. Even in Rome, where official religion shifted over centuries, the logic lingered. Gladiatorial combat, in its earliest form, was a funerary rite. Blood spilled in the arena was meant to appease the spirits of the dead, ensuring peace for the departed. What began as ritual became spectacle, but the roots lay in theology. Death fed the divine. In every case, rulers believed monuments were more than stone. There were cosmic contracts. To raise them without blood was to risk collapse, to tempt divine wrath, to stand on foundations as fragile as sand. Death was not incidental, it was structural, as essential as wood, clay, or granite. So when the pharaoh is said to have buried 10,000 alive, the act was more than cruelty. It was theology made real, the belief that only through blood could permanence be bought, that eternity demanded a down payment in flesh. But there is another layer, here psychology. Such acts did not just appease gods, they terrorized men. The pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive may have done so for the gods, but perhaps even more importantly, he did it for men. Acts of cruelty on such a scale were not only offerings, they were warnings. They carved fear into the minds of subjects, ensuring obedience long after the bodies were gone. Imagine standing on the edge of the desert, watching columns of workers dragged into a pit beside a rising pyramid. The screams echo. The dust rises, the ground itself seems to swallow men whole. You do not need a scribe to write a decree after that, you only need memory. Every survivor carried the story, and stories travel faster than armies. Fear ruled more effectively than any law. This was psychological warfare, thousands of years before the term existed. In Egypt, pharaohs were already seen as gods on earth. To disobey was unthinkable. But to witness their power expressed in blood etched that divinity into the soul. The monuments themselves became silent reminders. These stones are eternal, and so is the pharaoh's wrath. Other empires practiced the same logic. The Assyrians, for instance, were masters of terror. Their inscriptions brag about flaying rebels alive, stacking skulls at city gates, and impaling enemies for all to see. They didn't only kill, they broadcast the memory of killing, engraving it into stone reliefs and spreading it across conquered lands. It was cruelty turned into propaganda. In China, Qin Shi Huang's rumored burial of workers served the same dual purpose. Yes, it sealed the tomb spiritually, but it also told the empire that no one, not even those who built the emperor's eternal home, was beyond his control. Death followed his command, and so must the living. Even Rome understood this principle. Crucifixion was not only execution, it was theater. Victims lingered for days, nailed beside roads where every passerby saw their agony. It wasn't about punishing one, it was about controlling thousands through one body in torment. Cruelty, then, was not chaos. It was a system, a calculated act that created silence, obedience, and awe. The Pharaoh who buried 10,000 did not just kill men, he created a legend, a living memory of terror that kept generations in check. But terror, once unleashed, is double-edged. Fear can bind, but it can also provoke rebellion, desperation, and collapse. When the Pharaoh buried men alive, he was indeed just sealing stone with bodies. He was sealing his supremacy in the minds of every survivor. Terror became as enduring as granite. This was not chaos, but a system. And across history, other rulers perfected it. The Assyrians were the undisputed masters of this craft. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III didn't merely conquer, they choreographed cruelty. Inscriptions from Nineveh and Nimrod describe enemies flayed alive, their skins nailed to city walls. Rebels were impaled on stakes, left to writhe in the sun until death. But the cruelty didn't stop there. The Assyrians had artisans carve these horrors into stone reliefs that decorated their palaces. Anyone who entered the king's hall saw the message etched in permanence: resist, and this will be your fate. Terror was not just an act, it was propaganda, as polished as their architecture. Rome followed a different but equally ruthless script. Crucifixion was designed as public theater. Victims were nailed along busy roads, left dangling for days where every passerby could read the warning. The empire devours traitors. Spartacus's defeated rebels, 6,000 of them, were crucified along the Appian Way, turning a road into a gallery of agony stretching 120 miles. Rome didn't whisper its cruelty. Its soaring subjects lived under the shadow of fear, even when legions were far away. In China, Qin Shi Huang, as supposed burial of artisans, was not only ritual, it was a declaration that no one, not even those who served the emperor most loyally, could ever stand above his will. Later dynasties refined this lesson. Public executions, such as the notorious Linki, or death by 1,000 cuts, were carried out in crowded marketplaces to burn terror into collective memory. It was not about the victim alone, it was about the audience, about ensuring that fear outlived the condemned. Even in medieval Europe, the same pattern persisted. Traitors to the crown were hanged, drawn, and quartered in crowded squares. Each act was designed not just to punish, but to linger in the imagination, to make rebellion seem unthinkable. The message was clear across time and place. Cruelty was communication, power was persuasion through pain. The Pharaoh's legend fits seamlessly into this tradition. Whether he truly buried 10,000 alive, or whether the tale grew with time, its endurance proves its purpose. People remembered it not just as history, but as warning. A monument of terror needs no stone, it lives in the mind. Yet terror has its limits. It binds, but it also festers. The same cruelty that secures loyalty can breed hatred and rebellion. The Assyrian Empire collapsed under waves of enemies who remembered its brutality too vividly. Rome's spectacles, meant to awe, eventually numbed and disillusioned its people. Qin's dynasty, forged in fear, crumbled within a generation. Cruelty may secure obedience in the short term, but in the long arc of history, it corrodes the very foundations it was meant to protect. Empires built on blood often found that the same terror which held people together could just as easily pull them apart. Consider the Assyrian Empire, whose kings prided themselves on terror. Ashurbanipal and his predecessors described their atrocities in gleeful detail: eyes gouged out, rebels impaled, heads stacked in pyramids. For decades, it worked. Neighboring states surrendered rather than risk annihilation. But when the tide finally turned, it turned with fury. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes stormed Nineveh, burning the Assyrian capital to the ground. The cruelty that had kept enemies paralyzed now fueled their vengeance. Assyria vanished so completely from the map that later generations doubted it ever existed. The Roman Empire also learned this lesson. Crucifixion terrorized conquered peoples, but it also bred resentment. The Jewish revolt of 66 CE and the destruction of Jerusalem that followed were as much reactions to humiliation as to taxation. Every rebel crucified became not just a deterrent, but a martyr, feeding hatred across generations. Rome's spectacles and the Colosseum entertained the masses, but they also dulled civic life, numbing citizens to cruelty until decadence rotted the empire from within. The Qin dynasty in China collapsed with astonishing speed. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with control burning books, burying scholars alive, sealing his artisans into tombs left a legacy of resentment. Within a few years of his death, rebellion erupted. Farmers, soldiers, and scholars rose together, shattering his empire. The dynasty that had seemed unshakable lasted barely 15 years. The emperor's quest for eternal power had created only eternal hatred. Even in Egypt, cruelty carried risks. While pharaohs projected divine authority, periods of collapse, the intermediate periods were often sparked by uprisings of disillusioned peasants or ambitious nobles who had grown weary of tyranny. Legends of pharaohs burying thousands alive may not only reflect their power, but also the simmering resentment that ultimately fractured dynasties. The paradox of cruelty is this: it is immediate, it is effective, but it is unstable. Terror binds through fear, but fear alone is brittle. It cracks under pressure, and when it shatters, it unleashes fury far greater than loyalty. The very acts that made rulers seem immortal often ensured their empires were short-lived. And so, the story of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive is not simply about one man's cruelty. It is about the cycle of power itself, the way violence can forge empires, and the way memory can destroy them. The monuments may endure, but the cruelty lingers like a curse, a shadow that follows every stone. Empires rise and fall, monuments crumble, but stories endure. What makes the tale of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive so haunting is not just the act itself, it's the way it survived, whispered across centuries, reshaped with every retelling. Cruelty became not only history, but legend, a story that outlived the ruler and perhaps even the truth. Egyptian scribes preserved the memory of pharaohs through hymns, inscriptions, and temple reliefs. Their records often glorified rulers, but in between the lines, echoes of fear remain. A phrase like "he silenced rebellion" may be polished rhetoric, but to those who lived it, it meant brutality. Over time, as oral tradition wove around official records, tales of cruelty grew into epics. The pharaoh who buried thousands may have been remembered first as a stern ruler, later as a monster, and finally as a myth. The Greeks and Romans, encountering Egypt's ruins, amplified these stories. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, loved tales of extravagant cruelty, from Persian punishments to Egyptian customs. For him, the exotic was always tinged with terror. Later writers repeated and embroidered his accounts, turning hints of cruelty into spectacles of horror. In their retellings, Egypt became not only a land of gods and pyramids, but of ruthless kings who sacrificed thousands. As centuries passed, medieval chroniclers absorbed these stories into moral lessons. Pharaohs became archetypes of tyranny, warnings of divine punishment. The biblical tale of Exodus, with its plagues and the downfall of a proud pharaoh, merged with echoes of Egyptian cruelty to paint a picture of rulers so wicked that God himself intervened. Legends layered over legends, until the pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive stood as a symbol of human arrogance, punished by eternity. Even in the modern age, archaeologists and travelers fueled the fascination. Victorian explorers, gazing at pyramids half buried in sand, retold stories of slaves whipped to death, of workers entombed in stone. Whether fact or fiction mattered little, The cruelty was part of the monument's aura. The silent pyramids became louder than words, whispering of lives lost to immortalize one man. What matters most is not whether 10,000 truly died that way. What matters is that people believed it, repeated it, and passed it down. Legends of cruelty outlived the kings who committed them. They shaped how we see power itself, not just as majesty, but as menace. Legends of cruelty were not confined to dusty scrolls or whispers around fires. They traveled through time, reshaped and repurposed by new generations. The Pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive was not just an ancient tyrant. He became a symbol wielded by later rulers, priests, and even revolutionaries to justify or condemn power. In Rome, emperors often drew lessons from the tales of Egypt. Julius Caesar, who admired Alexander the Great and studied the histories of pharaohs, understood that monuments spoke louder than armies. Yet, he also knew that tales of excessive cruelty could turn a ruler into a villain of memory. This awareness shaped his self-presentation, not as a god demanding blood, but as a benefactor of the people, even as he consolidated absolute power. Medieval Christian chroniclers took pharaoh legends and folded them into sermons. The Pharaoh of Exodus and the Pharaoh of cruelty became merged in the popular imagination, a tyrant, so proud, so merciless, that God himself destroyed him. Preachers invoked these stories to warn kings against arrogance, reminding them that those who rule by blood are doomed to fall by divine judgment. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, as Europe rediscovered Herodotus and classical historians, the cruel pharaoh became a political metaphor. Philosophers like Montesquieu and Voltaire used him as shorthand for tyranny, contrasting despotism with the ideals of reason and liberty. The legend of 10,000 workers buried alive became a weapon of rhetoric, proof that unchecked rulers become monsters. Even revolutionaries found use for the tale. During the French Revolution, pamphleteers denounced the Bourbons as pharaohs of France, condemning them as monarchs who lived on the suffering of the masses. The image of slaves entombed in pyramids resonated with peasants who felt buried under centuries of oppression. It didn't matter if the story was fact or myth, it was truth in metaphor, powerfully alive in political imagination. And in the modern age, dictators and despots are still compared to ancient tyrants, whether Stalin, Hitler, or others of the 20th century. Commentators often reach back to Egypt for analogies. Rulers who sacrificed millions to build monuments, who demanded lives to cement legacies, who confused cruelty with eternity. The pharaoh who buried 10,000 workers alive remains relevant because his shadow stretches into every age where power consumes people for permanence. The legend is more than an echo of the past. It is a mirror for the present, a warning about how cruelty is remembered long after empires fall. Legends are more than memories of the past. They are tools wielded in the present. The story of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 workers alive, along with countless other tales of ancient cruelty, was retold and repurposed to justify new systems of power, to condemn tyranny, and to inspire rebellion. Greek historians like Herodotus, and later Diodorus, Siculus, framed Egypt as both wondrous and terrifying. By emphasizing the cruelty of pharaohs, they created a contrast with Greek ideals of citizenship and freedom. For them, Egypt was the archetype of Oriental despotism, a system where one man's whim consumed thousands. Rome inherited this lens. To Roman statesmen, invoking the cruelty of pharaohs or Persians reinforced the image of Rome as a liberating power. Even as Rome itself grew increasingly autocratic, pharaohs became metaphors for tyranny. The biblical story of the Exodus pharaoh, refusing to release Israel, punished by God's plagues, merged seamlessly with legends of Egyptian cruelty. Preachers in the Middle Ages drew on this archetype, warning kings that pride and oppression invited divine retribution. The pharaoh was not remembered as a ruler, but as a warning. His downfall used to terrify audiences into obedience to God rather than man. Thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire used Egypt as a case study in despotism. To them, the pyramids symbolized wasted human life, the extremes of monarchy unchecked. Voltaire once remarked that monuments of tyranny are built on bones. Such rhetoric was not antiquarian curiosity, it was political. These writers shaped an intellectual climate where monarchy was increasingly equated with oppression, and where revolution found its justification. During the French Revolution, pamphlets and speeches often painted the Bourbon monarchy as pharaohs of France. The analogy was clear. Like pharaohs, they extracted wealth and lives to sustain monuments of vanity, while the people suffered. Peasants, long burdened by famine and taxes, immediately understood the imagery. To call Louis XVI a pharaoh was to brand him as both tyrant and doomed, destined to fall, just as Egypt's cruel kings had. Even in the 20th century, dictators were often likened to pharaohs. Stalin's vast projects, the Moscow metro, the canals, the skyscrapers were described by exiles as modern pyramids built on bones. Hitler's ambition for Germania, a city to rival Rome, was cast by critics as the work of a new pharaoh demanding endless lives. Pol Pot, too, was compared to ancient tyrants, his forced labor camps echoing the nightmare of men sacrificed to ideology. What matters here is that cruelty endured not only as memory, but as metaphor. The pharaoh who buried 10,000 alive became less a figure of Egypt and more a universal symbol of tyranny. His legend was retold to make sense of oppression in every age. A mirror held up to warn that rulers who consume lives for monuments are remembered not as gods, but as monsters. Here's the final riddle of history. Why do we stand in wonder before monuments whose foundations may be soaked in blood? Why does the shadow of cruelty not repel us, but instead deepen our fascination? Take the pyramids of Giza. For centuries, travelers and scholars have debated how they were built. Were they the work of willing laborers, of slaves, or of thousands buried alive to sanctify the stone? The debate continues, but the paradox remains. Even if we knew they were built on cruelty, would we admire them less? Tourists still gaze upward, marveling at their impossible geometry, their defiance of time. Beauty has outlived horror, and perhaps that is its most unsettling power. This paradox is not unique to Egypt. The Colosseum in Rome draws millions of visitors, though it once drank rivers of blood. People photograph its arches, but rarely pause to imagine the thousands of gladiators and animals that died within. Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat, Persepolis are wonders that may have demanded suffering in their making. Yet the horror has become background noise, while the beauty stands in the foreground. Why? Because monuments are more than stone. They are stories, and stories transmute suffering into awe. When we look at the pyramid, we see not just granite blocks, but eternity. Not just cruelty, but ambition, mystery, transcendence. Human beings, for all their horror, created something larger than themselves. The cruelty is not erased, but it is absorbed into the legend, giving the monument both its shadow and its light. And there lies the warning. To marvel without remembering is to repeat. To remember without marveling is to deny the truth of human complexity. Monuments like these force us to hold both truths together. That beauty can be born from suffering, that cruelty can create wonder, and that history is rarely pure. The pharaoh who buried 10,000 workers alive, whether fact or legend, represents this eternal paradox. His cruelty ensured fear, his monument ensured awe, and thousands of years later, we still speak his name not as he intended, not as a god, but as a man whose quest for eternity demanded lives, and whose legend reminds us that power leaves scars even in stone. In the end, the tale of the pharaoh who buried 10,000 workers alive is less about a single ruler, and more about the eternal question: what price will humanity pay to touch eternity? His monument rose from the desert not only as a triumph of stone, but as a tomb for ambition, cruelty, and human resilience alike. Civilizations rise and fall, but the monuments remain. They remind us that history is not written in ink, but carved into bone, blood, and stone. We marvel at their beauty, yet behind every block lies the echo of voices silenced, of lives consumed in service to another's dream. That is the paradox we inherit: to admire while remembering, to be inspired while never forgetting the human cost. The pharaoh's name may fade into the dust, his power long extinguished, but the story endures because it forces us to confront the dual nature of humanity, capable of creating wonders, yet too often through cruelty. Eternity, it seems, is not only measured in stone, but in the shadows it casts. And so, when we gaze upon the pyramids, we are not just looking at monuments of ancient Egypt. We are staring into the mirror of ourselves, the ambition, the fear, the cruelty, and the beauty that define the human story. Because history is never just the past. It is always a reflection of who we are and who we may yet become.